Okay, so before I get into finishing up last week's chapter and this week's chapter, I wanted to cover the papers because we have one more due and I want everyone to get as many points as they can. So I saw mainly the same errors again with these papers, so I'm going to cover that again just one more time. I did take off points this time if there were multiple APA formatting errors. So a few of you guys had like one tiny little thing and you tried, so I could tell that there was improvement, that kind of thing. I didn't take any points off, but if there were multiple errors or if someone didn't even try to do APA at all, I did take off points. So since I saw the same errors over and over again, I'm going to cover that again. So remember to make sure that this is Times New Roman. So I saw that this was not a lot, the number. So I would go through, make sure it's times. So this is an odd amount of space, and then you see it again down here. Especially if you're seeing papers over and over and over again, like I can tell. So you want to highlight the whole thing. Go here. I have it on double space like it should be, but something's off. So this should be 0, and this should be double. This is exactly what I do to everyone's paper. As soon as I get it, I go through and make all of these changes, and that's a lot of the edits that you're seeing. So if you go ahead and do it before I do, then you won't have a problem. So that kind of shrunk up that extra space. It makes it look much nicer. Another thing I saw, some people didn't have a title at all, or they did and it wasn't bold, so make sure that that's bold, that kind of thing. I saw multiple people put abstract here instead of the title of their paper. So first of all, you don't need an abstract at all for these papers. I've talked about that before. But then secondly, I had some students who wrote me abstract, which is just extra work on your part, but I also had a few students who wrote the word abstract instead of the title of the paper. So an abstract is not your paper. Those are two different things. So make sure that that's the title, and that would be your first heading. Yeah. So then I saw most people use the headings correctly, but just remember that when you're doing headings, it's almost like an umbrella. So you have your main one, and then heading 2 would go under your main one, unless it's completely unrelated, that kind of thing. Same with heading 3, it would go under heading 2. If it's completely unrelated and it's a completely new topic, you would just do a new heading number 2, which is what most papers were like for you guys. Having the multiple headers comes up more when you're doing a full research paper, so it shouldn't be an issue here. Okay. I think those were the main things I saw. Once again, if you are referencing information that's not common knowledge, you need to reference it. So put in a citation, have a reference page at the end. If it's common knowledge or your own thoughts, reactions, that kind of thing, you don't need to cite it, but you don't want to commit plagiarism, and this could come up more as you're writing more and more papers throughout your education, so I want to make sure you're covered here. The only other thing is, I'm not sure if everyone understands what I've been doing when I make edits, so you can go to review right here and turn on track changes. So I don't know if you guys get a paper that looks like this from me and you're wondering, why am I sending you a paper that has nothing on it? That's because if you did this, you would see that, let's say I change this. You'd see my edits right there. So that's what I've been doing to everyone's papers. When you're finished with the paper, you've looked over my edits, maybe you want to use this as a template for your next paper, which is what I suggest. Well, that doesn't help with my example. You would go to review and you would accept it. So see, now it's accepted. You don't have the writing on the side of the screen. You can use this for your next paper if you wanted to. I think that's about it. So you can see my edits. You'll see on the side I put your grade. If you had points taken off, I put it right there. Throughout, I put some notes, that kind of thing. So just in case you guys aren't noticing that, that's what's going on. So like I said, I took off some points for APA formatting, and I will again for the next paper. And then I also took off points if it was late, and I took off points if your paper was not at least 3 full pages. Other than that, everyone seemed to get the assignment pretty well. The papers were well written. They covered, for the most part, exactly what I wanted. They were very creative, so I was happy with all of the papers. But keep that in mind for the next one. The only other thing I wanted to cover before I get into the lecture is I've decided to offer extra credit. So for those of you guys who maybe didn't do as well on the midterm as you'd hoped, or if something goes wrong with the final, or maybe you've had to turn in a paper late, or you've missed some discussion posts, for whatever reason, if you need extra points, I'm offering 5 extra points. So that could bring your grade from an 85 to a 90 at the end of the quarter. So the assignment is very open. I want you guys to be creative. Think of a movie, a TV show, a song, any of those will work. And write a 3-page paper, at least 3 full pages, in APA format, that just talks about your own reflections, things you've learned in class, maybe if you want to reference some stuff, but things you've noticed in that movie, TV show, or song that relate to cultural competency. So there's really no right or wrong way to write this paper, unless you completely did not write about culture at all, then it would be wrong, I suppose. But it's just meant for extra credit, something creative, but putting some effort into it. So if you have any questions about that assignment, feel free to ask me. But like I said, there's not a lot of direction to give you. I just want you to be creative with it. So that will be due on November 11th at 5:30. So that gives me a week to grade it, and then add it to your grade for the final, that kind of thing. So that's the extra credit assignment. And I think that's it for that. So I'll jump in. Okay, so we were finishing up the chapter on working with Latin American and Latino descent families and individuals. So this slide is talking about working with children, so special considerations to take into account when you're working with kids. So there are 2 key factors to take into account. The first one is age. So as the counselor or clinician, audiologist, whatever you are, you need to take into account their age and make sure that your interventions are developmentally appropriate for them. So that might mean kind of getting down on their level a little bit. And that's something I see a lot with people who work with kids. Usually when you're working with kids, you end up working with their parents a lot more than you're actually working with the child. So just remembering that it's the kid's life. They might be confused, not know what's going on. So taking time out to sit down with them and explain what's going on, and not just assume that their parents are talking about it outside of the session, that kind of thing. Involve them, ask them questions, see if they have questions. I can't tell you how many times I like to work with kids, children and adolescents. That's the majority of the patients I work with now. And I always ask them, why do you think you're here? What do you think is going on? And you get the most off-the-wall answers like, I don't know why I'm here, or no one talked to me about it, or I'm crazy. You just get all kinds of stuff. So taking some time to explain what's going on to them at their level is very important. The next one is birthplace. So compared to those born in the United States, children who were born in native country and immigrated to the U.S. are more likely to experience academic difficulty. They're less likely to attain cognitive fluency in Spanish or English, so either language. And they face greater risk for acculturative stress. So those are things to keep in mind as well. So with kids of Latin descent, you can use individual therapy, group therapy, or family therapy interventions. So keep in mind the influence of family and school systems. We've talked about systems theory before a bit, and this is going to come up a lot with any culture, really. But if you change one part of the system, the whole thing's going to be disruptive. So you kind of have to keep everything in mind, and it can be helpful to include multiple parts of the system, especially when you have like a collectivist culture, that kind of thing. Group interventions might give a unique opportunity to share similar experiences with peers, and it can enhance universality and cohesion. So like kind of giving the kids a family environment within the group setting, if that makes sense. It's important to be aware of the kids' knowledge of and identification with their heritage, any immediate and extended family members, where they live, their fluency in English and Spanish, and which language they prefer to use with counseling. Their upbringing regarding the role of gender socialization, so that can be important, and their reactions to experiences with racism and discrimination. And then self-concept and self-efficacy, especially as it relates to academic performance. So those are all things that you probably want to cover with any child or adolescent you work with that's of Latin American descent. Okay, so counselors should pay close attention to academic experience of adolescents. I've already kind of talked about that. So typical developmental adolescent experiences are already difficult enough as it is, right? And we talked about like identity formation, that kind of thing. So any kid's going to struggle already. But when it comes to being an immigrant or a refugee, it's just exacerbated by the English proficiency, the need to balance home and school cultures. So kind of that biculturality that we talked about before, that balance. And limited parental involvement in school and social interests. So if you remember before, we talked about multiple reasons for that happening. Parents may feel uncomfortable. There might be a language barrier. They may not know about all of the resources. And these are all reasons why they might not be as involved in their kids' academic life. They might have multiple jobs, all of this stuff. So counselors must assess the type and quality of relationships adolescents have with their parents and other family members. Counselors working with these adolescents should be aware of difficulty reconciling that bicultural status that we talked about, any feelings towards adhering to gender-related expectations in the face of like their new American values, sexual orientation development, limited exposure to culturally related extracurricular activities, and sports. The potential substance use as a coping mechanism for stress, and level of experience and exposure to various career opportunities. So once again, this can kind of show where you can become an advocate for your client, kind of taking this stuff into account, maybe educating them a little bit, psychoeducation, helping them find maybe extracurricular activities outside of the school or cultural groups, all of that. Individual interventions. So this can be effective, especially with those pressures associated with biculturalism. So kind of talking through that with your client, your child or adolescent client. And then group interventions. Another way that they can be effective is to help with any gender socialization struggles that the child may have. So kind of talking that through with the group. So caballerismo is a more recent term that's been used, I suppose, within the counseling world. So that means being a gentleman and kind of switching the viewpoint from that machismo that we've talked about before to caballerismo might help male adolescents kind of navigate those gender roles, if that makes sense. So this is a more pro-social type of masculinity for adolescent Latinos, so more of a gentleman as opposed to a macho tough guy. Another thing that's important is including family. We talked about that, so immediate and extended. It can be tricky, but it can be very helpful. And the book mentions brief strategic family therapy as an effective form of therapy for Latin American and Latino adolescents and children. Okay. So, moving on to working with adults. So, when you're working with your adult clients with this cultural background, it's important to consider the impact of their immigration status and any practice of cultural and religious customs that they may have. That might be something important to bring into therapy. So first-generation immigrants may experience constant stress over undocumented immigration status, a sense of pride for achieving citizenship, or they might even have some guilt for having to sacrifice their affiliation with their country of origin or maybe leaving people behind, that kind of thing. The amount of time that they've lived in the United States can influence how much they adhere to their previous norms, customs, traditions, religious practices, and the newer ones, so how acculturated they are. So counselors should assess if and how adult clients presenting problems are associated with immigration and a longing for cultural connection. So it may not be related at all, or it may be a big part of it. So it's important to just kind of keep that in mind and put your feelers out, like everything else we've talked about. Counselors working with U.S. Latino adults should also be aware of adults who struggle with caring for their elderly parents in a society that doesn't really necessarily respect taking care of the elderly as much as maybe Latino culture would. So that kind of struggle, that sandwich generation, so the adults who are taking care of their own kids, but also their aging parents, that's stressful enough as it is. But if there's also more pressure there because of their culture of origin, and that's kind of clashing with U.S. customs, that could be even more stress. Those who experience discrimination in the workplace or who are underemployed, and part of this might be because of their educational attainment, that kind of thing. Those who find it difficult to connect with their children, so there are likely a lot of differences, and this would once again depend on what generation they are. But if the kids are very acculturated and the parents are not, that can cause some clashes there. Any feelings of powerlessness because they must depend on their children to serve as translators. Maybe their kids' English fluency is greater than theirs, so that can cause some stress. Those who feel the need to send remittances to family members, friends, or creditors in their native countries. So this makes it even more difficult to attain economic stability in the United States. So that can be even more stressful. So still talking about working with adults. So research shows that maybe a systems approach can be important and effective with working with U.S. Latino adults. Individual interventions can be considered when talking about different culturally related factors that may be impacting the presenting issue. So kind of peeling the onion and talking about that stuff one-on-one. Group counseling has been shown to be beneficial, especially with like the cohesion and the universality parts, the collectivist culture. So counselors should, one thing that I did want to note with that, it is important to remember that there are vast within group differences within the Latino community, just like there were within the Asian community and every other community we've talked about. So not just kind of lumping everyone together because they're all Latino. They might have completely different presenting issues, cultural backgrounds. There might be kind of some similarities, but just like any other group that you're forming, you want to really think about who you're adding to the group and how they could benefit each other and how they're presenting problems and their personalities and, all of these things might mesh or clash. So keep that in mind. You wouldn't do anything different here when you're running a group. Counselors should ask how clients would feel about involving immediate and extended family members, so keeping in mind potential resistance to seeking mental health from someone other than a family member or a clergy member. We've talked about that. So your client might be kind of hiding the fact that they're seeking help, or there might be some tension between them and family because they've sought help, so keep that in mind. And then culture gender genograms could be really helpful too. And they can enhance family therapy objectives, exercises, and goals. And we talked about that a little bit last week. So that is it for chapter 12. Okay. So chapter 14. This chapter is on counseling individuals and families of European descent. Okay, so one of the most significant developments of European history was the creation of the idea that Europe exists as a distinct region. So the Roman Empire helps create an infrastructure for stable living environments throughout the areas now defined as Europe. After the fall of the empire, this region consisted mainly of nomadic tribes, so like Anglos, Celts, Gauls, Saxons, Slavs, and had vague boundaries. So physical features and cultural practices were important in the self-determination of who was and who was not considered European. So very much on the physical and the practices, cultural practices. His pattern of categorizing themselves and others continued throughout history, so we still see that today. An important sociocultural factor was the adoption of the Christian religion. So the Christian-Islamic border was not merely one of physical territory, but it became an important social distinction as well. Laws passed in Europe to maintain strict Christian bloodlines, active participation in the Latin Christian Church, and obedience to the Pope were essential criteria for being considered European. During the late 15th century, there was an influx of European settlers to North America. Most early immigrants came for economic reasons, but some also came for religious freedom. It was a time of extreme religious intolerance, the very powerful dynamics that many were escaping, so oppression, class structure, that kind of thing, quickly began to appear within the colonies themselves. So fleeing those issues and then kind of bringing them along with them. Early settlements were very diverse. Included colonists from England, Scotland, Germany, France, and Africa, as well as Jews and Christians. And you also saw kind of settling within their own groups here as well, so a little tribalism. The English had social and political dominance over the colonies overall. European ethnic groups intermarried, with English culture and values remaining dominant, and individuals of other ethnic backgrounds assimilated to what became kind of this English-American culture that was created. Okay. So here is a nice chart that kind of shows which groups came, when, and where they settled, and kind of why they came. So first off, we have the Anglos, Germans, and Poles, and they came for financial opportunities. Then you have the Dutch, who came for, once again, financial opportunities. Swedes came a little bit later, fur and tobacco trading. Quakers, so Anglos and Germans, came in 1664 for the Holy Experiment, so for people to live in peace. And then the French came for farming and plantations. So this is like the early colonial period. Okay. So European immigration began in the 1600s and still continues today. Between 1820 and 1998, approximately 61% of the over 64 million legal immigrants in the United States came from Europe. So 61%. European immigrant children and families represent diverse and intercultural groups. So just like every other group we've talked about, very diverse, lots of within-group differences. Arbitrary hierarchies that distinguished old immigrants from new ones, or more specifically, that distinguished ethnic groups of Northern and Western Europe from those of Southern and Eastern European countries, have been in place throughout much of U.S. history. So you see those differences there. This discrimination was particularly prevalent during periodic mass migrations from certain European countries. Okay, so here's another nice little chart with the more immigration periods. So We have those coming from Ireland. Many of them came because of the potato famine and typhus outbreak. And you could see still like these communities within like New York, Chicago, that kind of thing. Germany, political turmoil. France, political turmoil. And you see all the French influences in New Orleans if you've been there. Italy, financial concerns. And we'll have more charts as we go along. So the term white is used to describe the larger racial group of European. And the term Caucasian is commonly used to describe this group. It's kind of used interchangeably, but it's not actually really correct. So Caucasian is actually an ethnic group of people traditionally from the Caucasus region. And that's a narrow piece of land between the Black and Caspian Seas. So it's a very specific location and group of people. And pretty much most all whites that you meet are not from the Caucasus region. So it's not actually correct. And a few of you guys have written that in your papers. You use Caucasian instead of white throughout papers you've written me. So that's what I'm talking about when I write the note saying the preferred term is usually white, because most people they're not actually Caucasian. Okay, moving on. So European American generally refers to individuals living in the United States who are recent immigrants from or identify closely with European heritage in terms of values, traditions, and worldview. And then white American ethnic describes individuals of European descent who ethnically identify themselves as American and who have adopted the cultures, traditions, and values of the dominant culture in the United States. So European American would be more recent. White American ethnic, or just white or American, has been in the United States for quite a while. There are 3 specific contributions to the development of the white American ethnicity, and that includes the American melting pot, so that concept, the American dream, and the creation of a national heritage. So the melting pot. This term was commonly used as a metaphor to describe the process of combining a variety of cultural backgrounds and beliefs to create a new and virtuous culture. So the idea was bringing all of these differences together into a melting pot to create a new kind of inclusive culture that everyone adheres to, if that makes sense. The idea was that it's okay to be different as long as one accepts the mainstream values. So that mainstream value would be the one that everyone came together to kind of form as one, the American culture. Non-Europeans were largely excluded from adding their contribution or flavor to that cultural pot, leading to both marginalization of and discrimination against non-white or non-English speaking Americans. With the civil rights movement, the melting pot idea was replaced with a new sense of multiculturalism, focusing on inclusion and ethnic pride. So new metaphors suggested for this kind of shift are salad bowl or quilt. Okay, so the American dream, this is the manifestation of that American culture and value. So this new, like the melting pot idea that I just gave, the American dream is the manifestation of that. So it reinforces the notion of the United States as being a utopia. It explains the country's political and social structure, incorporates the nation's stated ideals of liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness, and provides an explanation for the success of Americans, as well as a justification for other families and groups' financial struggles. So meritocracy describes a belief that individual success is based on personal skill, ability, and work ethic rather than external factors. So that kind of individualist way of viewing things. You know, you work hard, you get further in life. As part of the rise of nationalism in the early 1900s, the U.S. Department of Defense began funding the preservation of war monuments which began the process of creating a collective memory and the beginning of our national heritage. The U.S. educational system has provided a vital link in the promotion of national heritage and collective memory created by the dominant culture. So that's kind of how it's passed down from generation to generation. American students learn about this history, and the school system serves to shape and reform students from diverse backgrounds into being, part of this new culture, if that makes sense. Okay. So every white family was an immigrant family at some point. And this was brought up when you guys did your first paper. The transition from European ethnic to white American ethnic is dependent on the individual or family being identified as racially white. Prerequisites for being included in this category have been dramatically altered over the years. So this is about who gets to be white. So most exclusive levels of society were contingent on physical characteristics, language, religious beliefs and practices, political affiliations, economic stability, and willingness to adopt white Protestant culture. And the idea of race as a physical reality began to emerge in the 17th century. So parameters for identifying who was white became more inclusive over time. Effective assimilation strategies for immigrants, including speaking English, adopting American names, receiving an American education, and maybe marrying into a white family. The dominant culture expanded to include other English-speaking or Western and Northern European ethnicities, so like German, French, Scottish, Irish. The world wars in Europe affected the development of the white American ethnicity. Genocide based on ethnicity prompted Americans to take a far more accepting view of others. In addition, a new vast middle class was created when soldiers and families who were largely uneducated before came home and attended college under the GI Bill. So we saw a shift in this group. Access to college, a college education, and subsequent middle-class wages provided opportunity for previously excluded groups to enter the white American ethnicity if they chose to. Non-European individuals are rarely able to fully become white, but European immigrants can become white. There's a strong debate over the process of becoming white. When individuals do become white, the privileges associated with being a member of the majority culture follow. The process of becoming white also has its disadvantages. So European Americans have a myriad of intergroup differences, and understanding these differences is vital to understanding the individual. So we talked about this with every single group. Even though there may be some shared cultural values, religious practices, all of that stuff, there's still a lot of within-group differences. So for whites, we see within-group differences of European ethnicity development, European ethnic identity, and the degree to which individuals identify with their European heritage. So that varies widely. Socioeconomic status, educational level, geographic variables, religious views, generational differences, non-ethnic marginalized group identity. So this could be ability status or relationship orientation. So the list goes on and on. Many differences. So some common cultural values or characteristics that you do see within groups are listed in these charts. I'm not really going to go over them. It's just kind of interesting information. So 53 nationalities have been identified within the larger European American umbrella. European immigration continues, and in 2003, immigrants of European descent represented approximately 30% of documented immigrants. So we've seen a shift over time. Current European immigrant children and families representing a very broad range of diverse and intercultural groups. So 40% of European immigrants come from Eastern Europe, so that would be like Poland, Russia. 40% from Northern and Western Europe, so that would be like the UK, Germany. And then 16% from Southern Europe, so Italy, Portugal, Greece. Immigrants are individuals living in a country other than their native country. So they're non-citizens of a host country granted legal permission to permanently reside in the new host country. In 2013, over 91,000 European immigrants were granted legal permanent status by the United States. Undocumented immigrants refers to non-citizens of a host country who did not go through the procedures established by the host country's policies. So this could be people on temporary status who stayed beyond the established time, maybe someone who entered the host country without going through inspection, that kind of thing. Refugees, this refers to people who are living outside their native country and who are granted permission to set up residence in a host country because they are either unable or unwilling to return to their native country for fear of prosecution or persecution. And then international students. So these are individuals living in a host country for the purpose of pursuing a degree, often an advanced degree. So although international students can apply to stay in the host country to pursue career opportunities post-graduation, most eventually end up returning to their home countries. So the fact that European immigrants may share physical and cultural features with the dominant culture within the United States can lead to acculturation issues and pressures that are quite unique to European immigrant populations. So some of these stressors are like experiencing a process similar to grieving when adjusting to a new country, feeling isolated, maybe feeling shame, feeling disconnected from their community, their family and friends, being devalued and silenced, and then communication difficulties for any non-English speakers. Okay, so in the United States, acculturation is often used to describe cultural groups adapting to that white American, that mainstream lifestyle, values, language. Acculturation does not follow a linear model. It's more complex. It's more like a cyclical process with repeated interactions with the host culture and the individual's interpretation of those experiences, kind of what they take away from those experiences and how that shapes who they are. Ethnic identity reconstruction is an interactional model in which individuals participate in a process within of building ideas about one's identity through a discourse with others within important social contexts. Factors include culture of origin, identity attitudes, preferences and lifestyle of immigrant population, political climate, and climate of a host country, and then the interaction between all of these. Since European immigrants look white, they may not be viewed as foreigners, and they may have an easier time assimilating. However, if it may be assumed that recent European immigrants, especially those with good English skills, are more acculturated than they are. So more assumptions might take place. Because communication plays such an important role in adolescent socialization, we talked about that, children and adolescents are more often motivated to learn English to establish relationships with their peers. So they might feel that it's more important for them so that they can interact and work through that identity process, that stage. It's important to consider that children might experience rejection and isolation within their family, but then also within their community system when forming unions with individuals from diverse backgrounds. So they're going through that bicultural kind of balance, just like the other cultures that we've talked about. Cultural conflicts can also come into play around family structure and gender roles with recent European immigrants. So very similar to some of the other groups we've talked about. Like most other U.S. immigrants from Europe also face and continue to face discrimination in a variety of ways when arriving to the United States. So many European groups have been negatively stereotyped within the mainstream U.S. culture. Overt discrimination is more likely to exist when immigrants have more visible or dramatic differences from the majority culture. So this could be like a really strong accent or an ethnic name or any physical attributes. European immigrants may face more subtle, but just as damaging systemic oppression as well. Immigrants who have poor English language skills are far more likely to be underemployed, regardless of skill level or education. Mental well-being and pathology are largely Western European constructs. We talked about that like the first week of class. Many early theorists are white males of European or European American descent. And thus their approaches were developed within their cultural context. So evidence for this can be seen in the individual focus of many early therapy styles. This focus on individual responsibility, the use of the medical model to describe diagnoses, among others. So you can see a lot of that influence there. Disruption of autonomous functioning is a major consideration for diagnosis of just about every mental health disorder within the DSM. So you can see that that influence there as well. The cultural belief in meritocracy, sorry guys, can lead to feelings of inferiority and shame over perceived failures, particularly among working class white men. So this is how some of the values of the majority culture and of European culture can cause some issues with these individuals. So scapegoating is a common way white American ethnics deal with these feelings. The Calvinist idea that good fortune is evidence of righteousness and predestined salvation can also contribute to people's confusion over tragedy. So like things are seen as unfair when bad things happen to good people, that kind of thing. With the value placed on independence and individualism, failure to overcome an obstacle can be seen as due to a personal weakness. So that could be an issue that's brought up in therapy. Individuals and families may retreat from help and mask painful feelings with abusive behavior that can come up. Inconsistencies within the larger culture, so like denying liberty to others, can contribute to some stress, frustration. The focus on the individual can mean that the family good is often sacrificed for the good of the individual within the family. Individuation from the family is widely valued, but timing of individuation can have a profound effect on the future development of a child. So if there's a premature identity foreclosure or some enmeshment, that kind of thing, that can affect someone over time in the long run. Individualism may play a role in marital problems as well. And then the value on youth and the characteristics commonly associated with youth, so beauty, athleticism, freedom, that kind of thing, can contribute to emotional difficulties, especially with older white Americans and those who have disabilities. Whereas other cultures place a great deal of respect on elders within society, their wisdom, white American ethnics are more likely to complain about what they lose as they get older than the wisdom or respect that they accumulate over time. So like a different viewpoint. Cultural norms discourage expression of emotion, especially really difficult emotions. So talking about problems with strangers, like mental health professionals, can be seen as a sign of weakness. Culture, particularly European and white American culture, plays a significant role in the traditional theoretical approaches. We talked about this a moment ago. So humanist and group approaches may not be as in line with white American cultural norms, while psychodynamic, behaviorist, cognitive, Adlerian, and reality therapy stress the importance of European and white American values within the healing process. So, for example, accepting individual responsibility, committing to working hard, valuing the client's right to privacy, and focusing on objective, measurable goals to indicate success. Feminist and multicultural movements added awareness of the role of culture in the presentation of issues and the helping process. So when conceptualizing white American clients from a multicultural perspective, counselors should once again be aware of their own worldview and what they bring into session with them. Understand the major cultural values underlying the white American ethnicity. Begin to understand the unique worldview of the white American client, which may be based in white American values, but might also differ in significant ways due to a variety of social, geographic, generational, or personal factors and intersecting identities. So just like every other group we've worked with. Many white Americans, especially older ones, may not be comfortable discussing their culture, and may be a little bit unclear about their cultural values as well. So discussion about cultural values may begin as a more general discussion about like beliefs, approaches to life, family traditions, role models, that kind of thing, and then become a little more specific over time. There's probably a lot of exploration here. The counselor can conceptualize the role that cultural conflicts may play in the presenting problem and any underlying issues. So intracultural conflicts describe values and beliefs within the white American cultural framework that are in conflict with one another or conflict with the reality of the situation. So conflicts can arise between cultural beliefs and the client's personal beliefs. In this way, counseling white American clients can be similar to counseling clients of color and other recent immigrants. Establishing a relationship with the white American client is a crucial part of the healing process, just like every other group we've talked about. Many white Americans, in particular white males, are taught to withhold expression of emotions, so that might be an issue in therapy. Many white Americans will appreciate the autonomy to do the work counseling requires, but they might also expect the counselor to provide guidance early in the counseling process and lots of feedback regarding the process. Consciousness raising or helping clients develop insight or deepen awareness will likely play an important part in the counseling process. One of the more powerful gifts that effective consciousness raising gives to clients is the ability to choose. So choosing can play an important role in helping white American clients to live more according to the cultural values of freedom and equality for all people. Cross-cultural counseling is sometimes approached with trepidation regarding the ability to establish a therapeutic relationship, but the reality may be that cross-cultural relationships might be actually really helpful and therapeutic. It's important for counselors of color to fully develop the therapeutic relationship with their clients and to use this relationship to further that therapeutic insight. So counselors of color have a great opportunity to model an appropriate process for cross-cultural understanding and respect for different cultural values and practices. Intra-group differences are crucial in terms of country of origin, ethnicity, and immigration status. So common stressors might include pre-migration stressors, so whatever led to the decision to relocate, post-migration stressors, the stress of actually relocating, that process, any acculturation stress, strain on relationships, oppression, loss of social supports, all of that. Stress related to having high expectations for the move. Maybe some things weren't exactly what they expected. Loss of connectedness and feelings of being misunderstood. Lack of harmony and balance. Cultural conflict between the dominant culture in America and then the culture of their home. Financial problems, and this can lead to marriage conflicts. So European immigrant adults may initially seek counseling services due to employment and or financial concerns as a result of their transition. So often it's through an employee assistance program, something like that. So when this happens, they might face a lot of self-esteem or self-efficacy threats. And one way to encourage them to clarify their identity, both within their home culture and the American culture, is to explore their source of wellness. So when the family has children, further stressors can occur over identity development as well. European immigrant children and adolescents seeking counseling or psychological services will often be the first identified within the school system, and they're often first identified for academic concerns. So students might feel overwhelmed due to language differences, the pace of academic learning environment, individualistic structure of the classroom, different teacher-student relationship, unawareness of how to ask for help or who to even ask, confusing cultural foundation of the school. Academic difficulties can also contribute to emotional issues and conflicts within the family over performance. Children and adolescents from recent European immigrant families may also be referred for social issues. They may feel a sense of isolation or lack of connectedness caused by feeling different from other children, and this can affect their self-esteem and lead to feelings of shame and guilt. Adolescent immigrants may have to deal with negative stereotypes that other students may hold. They may be particularly prone to self-esteem issues because of that. The cultural, political, economic, and geographic experiences of migrants are different, although some unifying elements do exist. So these could be the search for protection from trauma, oppression, and isolation, search for better standards of living and experiencing a new lifestyle, a focus on survival, a sense of belonging that's replaced with isolation, a sense of harmony that's replaced with disruption, a sense of mastery that's replaced with being devalued, and a sense of independence that's replaced with dependence. So without understanding and healing, immigrants can become discouraged, and they might exclude, devaluate, and reject themselves and others. The experience of shame and disconnect may lead to unhealthy patterns of behavior and self-medication through alcohol or other substances. So counselors can help immigrant individuals and families rebuild a sense of identity and self-efficacy through sharing their stories from their home countries and constructing new narratives about their lives in the U.S. filled with hope and meaning. So the narrative approach to counseling might be particularly helpful for them. And there's more of a wellness orientation here as well. So the 3 core phases of narrative counseling include deconstructing the dominant cultural narrative, so examining one's experiences relevant to inferiority and superiority. The second phase is externalizing the problem, so distinguish problems as being ecological in nature rather than pathological. And then the third phase is reauthoring of the story. So reflecting on being successful in life despite or in concert with the American culture. So their experiences haven't changed, but the way they view it and kind of write their own story of how they've lived it can be changed, and that can be very helpful and help find meaning. Creative arts can help European immigrant clients find a means of identifying sources of disconnect and frustration. This can be particularly effective with clients who have difficulty expressing concerns verbally. Counselors who can provide safe environments for immigrant clients to describe and partake in cultural traditions and practices that are meaningful and relevant to them can help the families begin to reground themselves and begin the healing process. Counselors should explore with clients several elements that influence cultural identity and wellness, and this includes primary social networks, so like same ethnicity, mixed, other, that kind of thing. Cultural dimensions, place of nativity, acculturation level. Native culture context, so is it high, moderate, low? Immigration history, pre-migration dynamics, precipitating events, migration experience, post-migration, all that. Language dimensions, psychocultural dimensions, and then other sources of stress. So exploring regional cultural differences and living experiences is essential. Okay. So another way counselors can work to alleviate stress associated with immigration while promoting wellness is to work from a social justice perspective. So social justice counselors identify the 4 guiding principles of equity, access, participation, and harmony. So equity pertains to involvement in culture-centered approach, gives a voice to dynamics that have been silenced and ignored. Access pertains to a counselor's choice to clarify identity construction in self and clients. So reconstruct counseling frameworks based on differences, not deficiencies. Participation underscores the importance of mutuality and authenticity. So consider whose voice is heard and how decisions are made. Support those whose contributions are minimized or devalued. Ask whose stories are celebrated in education, media, and dominant culture. And then harmony pertains to searching for wellness by tapping into the cultural wisdom and deconstructing the process of devaluing that immigrants may be experiencing. So develop relationships with clients based on mutuality, provide an atmosphere of authenticity, and permission for clients to be who they desire to be. So that is all for chapter 14. So next week when we meet, we will finish, we'll cover the last chapter, which I think is diagnosing, something like that, from a multicultural perspective. And that will be the last chapter with all of the information for your final exam. That's it. So have a good night.